I want to preface this by saying that I'm not mad. I don't think I'm seeing things. I know I'm not. Something's happened to me. My friend Pamela, who lives a few doors down, she said I should try to take a photo or a video of what's been going on. I tried that. Nothing showed up. Just me talking to thin air. But there's a reason I know it's not all in my head. You see, the man appeared and, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. It started about 3 months ago. I was up late watching TV at night and I saw something out of my window. It was a bright light, like someone was shining a torch through the glass. My house is at the end of our street and looks out onto an old piece of waste ground where some of the local teens hang about and drink. I just thought it was one of them messing about with a torch. I looked out the window and I couldn't see anything. It was too dark, so I went to my door and shouted for the kids to bugger off. I never thought anything of it. I went back into the living room and the TV was on a channel I hadn't been watching, and the place was a mess. I always keep my newspapers and my magazines under the coffee table. I'm too lazy to take them out to the bin. But pages had been torn out from them and they were scattered all over the place. This happened in the space of what must have been 20 seconds or so. I thought someone was in my house, so I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and looked around. But there was no one else there. I made sure the house was locked up, checked the doors and the windows, but I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about an old poltergeist case from England that was famous during the 1970s. Objects moving around by themselves, that sort of thing. But strangely, it was the light outside that my mind couldn't stop fixating on more than anything else. After a couple of days, I'd managed to put the whole thing out of my head, until I was making dinner in the kitchen one night, and I heard something tapping on the glass window next to me, a window that faces the waste ground. The kitchen is on the ground floor and I had the blind down, but there was another bright light coming from outside, bright enough to shine through the blind. I stood rooted to the spot. The sight of the light made me feel almost nauseous with fear. Sure, I should have felt a little apprehension, but this was more than that. I could barely catch a breath. Then it was dark again. The fear dissipated and I hoped I'd catch a glimpse of who had been shining the torch through the window as they ran off into the night, so I pulled the blind open. Someone was standing outside, about an inch away from the glass. I could see the window fogging up from their breath. A chill went through me, and I couldn't understand the way they were standing. It was a man, but I couldn't see much of his features. He had his right arm crossing over his eyes, so I couldn't see what he looked like from the nose up. But it didn't make sense. Surely he couldn't have seen me either, with his eyes covered over. He was just standing there, not moving, not doing anything, just standing in that awkward pose with his arm over both eyes. A cold sweat came over me, and I remember thinking, not convincingly, that this was all some sort of weird joke designed to unnerve the guy who lives alone at the end of the street. I thumped the glass with my hand and told the man to get out of my garden. But he didn't move. He didn't respond. Again, the thought of it being a prank from some of the local kids came to me, but as I took in more of his features, that didn't make sense. The guy wasn't a teenager. I could see that much. He was in his 30s at least, maybe older. Although it was too dark to make out much else, I could at least approximate his age. When he didn't move, I started to think I was dealing with, a real psycho, so I shouted that I was calling the police, but I swear I turned to grab my phone, which was on the worktop behind me, and when I looked up, the man had vanished. All I could see was the dim outline of the waste ground beyond the boundary of my property. It was lit partially by a couple of well-spaced out street lamps. There was no way I was going to let this slide. I was almost angry at how frightened I'd felt. How dare anyone make me feel that way, I called the police and they said they'd send someone around to check out the garden. But when they turned up, there was no one around. They said to phone if the man came back, and that was that. I didn't exactly feel safe. I tried to sleep that night, but when I lay in bed, the image of the man at the window, covering his eyes with one arm, it stuck with me. When I was a wee boy, my mum would sometimes make me a cup of chamomile tea if I couldn't sleep, and it always was enough to make me tired. So I got out of bed with the same idea in mind. This must have been about 2 in the morning, and started to make my way to the kitchen. To move from my bedroom to the kitchen, I had to cross a hall, and when I did, I felt something just for a moment. It's something I'd only ever heard about, but hadn't experienced it myself. The hairs stood up on the back of my neck. I instinctively knew where to look, down the hallway to the front door of my house. I watched, paralysed by fear, as I saw the door handle move. It was as though someone was subtly testing the door to see if it was unlocked. Thankfully it wasn't, but the handle still moved. I didn't know what to do, so I shouted out, something garbled probably about getting away from the door. In response, the door handle stopped moving. On the top panel of the door is a round piece of glass about a foot in diameter. It's slightly misted and more for decorative purposes than security. Especially at night, it was almost impossible to see anything through it. That was until that same bright white light from the other nights throbbed on and off on the other side of the door for a moment. It cast itself upward, and I saw for only a second the same face as before, and in the same pose, a man covering his eyes with one arm. This time his mouth was open. The light pulsed on and off several times, very slowly, and it appeared that the face through the glass was talking. I could see the jaw moving. I shouted again that I would phone the police if he didn't leave, but that was when I started to hear something, very low and hushed, but I could almost hear the man's voice. Instinctively, I stepped towards the door so that I could hear better, and that was when a loud screeching noise bellowed from somewhere. It felt like the ground and my insides shook together. I didn't need to check after that. The hairs on the back of my neck had returned to their usual relaxed state. The man was gone, light, voice, screeching sound and all. I phoned the police, but again they found nothing. I think they were starting to believe I was making things up. I spoke with a neighbour of mine, Pamela, during the day, who lived back along the street a few houses, and she told me that She'd had some issues with someone prowling around the outside of her house a couple of years previous. When she installed a security camera, the problem went away. So she said maybe I should try that. At least if the guy came back, I'd have something concrete to show the police. Seemed like a good idea. So that was when I became determined to capture some footage of the man, for my own sanity and so the authorities could identify him. The following night, I waited up until nearly 4 AM with a video camera in hand, but there was no sign of anything. So I eventually I was exhausted, so I went back to bed, and that was, well, until I heard something at my bedroom window. I got up out of bed, grabbed the video camera and turned it on and looked through the glass. But there was nothing and no one there. All I could see was the large piece of waste ground out beyond my garden. But I could hear something. It was a muffled voice, and I was sure it was the man's voice, but how could that have been? I couldn't see him. I moved my head to about an inch from the glass, and just as I made out the words, "The light won't stop shining," a hand slammed against the glass. I jumped back. The hand was out there, kind of hovering, but it was like it came out of the air from nothing. It was pale and covered in what looked like soil. I then heard the voice shout those same words again, "The light won't stop shining." And then the hand pulled back. When it did, I suddenly saw the shape of a figure move off out of the garden. I used the video camera and I zoomed in as best I could, but when I looked through the viewfinder, I could see nothing. Then when I looked with my own eyes through the window, there it was, the figure of the man walking off into the waste ground. I looked again at the viewfinder, but again it was showing me no sign of the man. And by the time I looked back through the glass, the man had then vanished. I guess that was when I started to suspect that I wasn't dealing with a normal prowler. I now entertained the idea that the man wasn't alive. No amount of chamomile tea was going to let me sleep after that. Instead, I spent the rest of the night re-watching the video footage I'd taken. Not only had it captured nothing of interest visually, but even the voice I had heard with those unforgettable words, "The light won't stop shining," that hadn't been recorded. There was nothing. A few hours of delving into websites about hauntings and things of that ilk later brought me to a forum called Things Unseen. It was a place for people to share their paranormal adventures. Most of it was nonsense, I was sure. People playing at Ghostbusters, running around in abandoned places with video cameras and voice recorders, scaring each other and making up events to ensure that, the endeavour was never pointless. But I didn't know where else to go. There was a section of the forum specifically dedicated to experts, and I say that with inverted commas, experts giving their advice to people interested in investigating the paranormal. I wasn't so much interested in investigating it, but I did want to find out if there was a way to get this man away from my house so I could sleep. I posted about my experience, told them nothing was showing up on camera, and mentioned every detail I could think of about the light, about what the man had repeated, about him covering his eyes with his arm, and the fact that he wandered out towards the waste ground. Then I finally passed out once the sun came up. A few hours later, I got up had a shower and went for a walk in the sunshine to clear my head. In the sun, the neighbourhood, and especially the area next to my house, that piece of waste ground, seemed harmless. But even as I walked, I couldn't erase the sight of the man wandering off towards it before vanishing. That was the first indication that the experiences I was having were going to have an impact on how I saw my home. When I finally returned to my house, I checked my computer and saw that a few people had answered the post that I'd made on the forum. Most of it I couldn't get on board with. Burn sage in your home, get an exorcist, move out, one person even posted. That last one was the most reasonable in some ways, and if I was going to be visited by that man and that light every night, well, I'd have no choice but to leave. But where would I go? I had very little money. If I was going to be made homeless from these visits, I had to at least try something that might solve the problem. That was when, amongst all the talk of crystals and other hokum I filed under pure fantasy, I saw an answer to my post that caught my eye. It was very grounded, the way it was written. The person who had made the post, they wished to remain anonymous. They were a long-time lurker on the forum of things unseen, but had to make an account just to answer my post. They said that they'd had a similar experience, that something had visited their home at night from outside. In her case, she had lived in a small town in America, with her home looking out to a collection of woods. At night, a small girl would wander out of the woods and walk around the outside of the woman's home, looking sad. It became clear to the woman that the girl was dead, as sometimes she would appear as a rotting corpse in a white dress. The woman tried everything to escape the horror of this every night, but the only thing that worked was to try and discover what the girl wanted. One night, the woman followed the girl back into the woods with a friend, and then found her standing next to a large redwood tree. The woman claimed that she'd actually spoken with the girl there and then. She said she was lost, and that the tree was the only thing familiar to her. When the woman explained to the girl that she was dead, she sobbed into her white dress. The woman then asked the girl what year she thought it was, and the girl said 1926. So the woman told the girl that her parents were waiting on the other side for her, and that she should be with them, that she could be with them if she wanted to. The girl started to fade away there and then as she was told this, like that was all she needed to know. Apparently the young girl turned and smiled as she faded and ran off to two shadowy figures that came out of the trees. She ran up to them and they embraced, and then suddenly they were gone. The woman wrote that she never saw the girl again, but she did find some inscriptions carved into the wood of that tree she'd been returning to, and one of them was dated 1926. Carved in was the name Alice, so she assumed that was who the little girl was. It was the woman's belief then that the man who was visiting me at night was trapped by his lack of knowledge. He was wandering every night and didn't know he was dead. All I had to do was tell him he was dead, and then he would pass on to the other side. She even speculated that the light I was seeing, the light that the man said wouldn't stop shining, was the light from the other side, from the afterlife. When I saw him shielding his eyes from the light, that was symbolic of his refusal to accept that he had to move on to whatever there is after. There was something about the woman's words. Just a few nights before, I would have laughed at them, but there was a sincerity in the way they were written. She believed them, And if all I had to do was tell the man that he was dead and had to move on, then it would be worth it. It'd be worth a shot. Not that I was keen on facing him, but I just wanted sleep. And the idea of abandoning my home because of these nightly visitations, that was not one I gladly entertained. I wish I had asked a friend to accompany me. But something stopped me. I think I was embarrassed. People would have thought I'd gone mad. Oh, hey, would you mind coming over tonight while I tell a dead man he needs to go to heaven? Yeah, that didn't seem crazy at all. And so I was going to face it alone. I tried to get some more sleep during the day so that I was fresh-faced for the night, but I couldn't fall over. When darkness finally came, I was exhausted, but I grabbed a torch and a knife of all things, opened the door to the cool night air, and then sat in a garden chair outside my front door and waited. I waited and I waited. By about 2 a.m, nothing had happened, and I was starting to feel sleepy. I remember looking at my watch. I think it was just before 3 a.m. when I realised I'd closed my eyes. I must have nodded off for a few minutes, and when I opened my eyes, I looked out towards the waste ground and saw someone standing underneath one of the 2 street lamps. At first I thought it was someone who was very much alive, but then it happened. A bright light momentarily flared up around the figure. I couldn't bear staring at it. It was so bright. I covered my eyes, and when the light had faded away, I looked across again and saw that the figure beneath the street lamp was still covering his eyes with his arm. He was kind of moving around, slightly, almost circling the spot of ground anxiously. It was the man. I knew it. I had never been so nervous, but this had to end. Torch in hand, I walked out of my garden and started to walk across to where the man was standing. Telling you, every step I took, my blood froze. As I got closer, I could hear the man mumbling over and over, "The light, the light, the light won't stop shining." When I was just a few feet away from him, he stopped moving around, but his arm was still across his eyes. "Who's there?" he said in a frightened voice. I'll never forget it. What do you say to a ghost? I guess I just spoke to him as a person. I think I said, "I live in the house you've been visiting." "The light won't stop," he said, trembling. "It's a good light," I tried to say to him. "I'm sorry, but you're dead, and you need to go into that light to be happy again." It seems such a ridiculous thing to say, but that was all that came to me. Dead? He sounded surprised. I took a step closer and tried to reassure him. "It's okay. You'll be safe there." And that was when he dropped his arm from his eyes. I've never seen anything like what I saw then. The man's face was horribly burned from the nose up. I could see the white of his skull through patches where the skin was either gone or painfully thin. And then there were his eyes. All I can say is that they were sealed. The skin had fused over where his eyes should have been. The man must have been blind. "The light," he said once again, and I was confused. How could he even see the light with his face like that? I cleared my throat and said again, "The light is heaven. Go to it." And then he was gone. I don't know if it happened when I blinked or if he just vanished to the other side in front of me. The waste ground then it felt empty. And I was shaking. All I wanted was to get back to my house and hope that I'd never have to deal with anything so unreal, so uncanny ever again in my entire life. Turning, I took a step towards my garden, but my left foot was stuck on something in the ground. A crushing pain encircled my ankle, and I instinctively shone my torch down at my foot to see what had happened. I hadn't caught my foot in anything, but something had caught me. A rotten, burned hand was sticking up out of the waste ground, and it had grabbed me by the foot. I let out a scream for help, but my voice just echoed around the emptiness of the place. The hand squeezed around my ankle, and then another hand reached up out of the ground and grabbed hold of my knee. It yanked me down, and I lost my footing. Before I knew what was happening, my body was in a prone position, and my face was full of dirt from the ground. Two arms wrapped around my body. They yanked and pulled at me. It was as if they were trying to pull me into the ground itself. Then a face pushed up out of the ground, and I screamed again as it pressed against mine. The eyes were fused shut, and the rotten mouth opened and shut, the teeth with this horrible clattering sound. Then I remembered the knife I had brought. I pulled it out of my pocket and brought it up over the burned face. Repeatedly I stabbed down and down and down with each strike. But it did no good. The knife passed through the face like the thing was half solid, half of this world and half of somewhere else. The hands continued to pull at me, and the face rubbed against mine. The closing shut and opening up again and again and again of the jaw. It was desperately trying to pull me down into the ground, but its efforts were in vain, and I think it realised that eventually. A blinding white light shone momentarily around us. I covered my eyes from it, and with a groan and a scream of its own, the figure tried to cover its eyes. Letting go of me, I was able to break free from its other arm and stagger to my feet. I didn't run to my house. I didn't run to any house on that street. I just kept running and running until the madness of fear left me, and I slumped down onto a park bench a couple of miles from my home. After a thing like that, you don't go back. Some friends and family who all thought I had a breakdown, they volunteered to go to the house and get me some of my things. They wouldn't listen to me. I was prescribed some anti-anxiety meds from a doctor, and even she wouldn't entertain the finger marks I showed her on my ankle. Maybe you were attacked, but the rest was a hallucination, she said. Yeah, right. A friend gave me a spare room in his place for me to stay until I was ready to sell the house. I felt bad selling it to anyone, to be honest. I had to eventually, so I made sure it wasn't sold to someone with kids or anyone elderly or living alone. I told the real estate agent it had to be a couple in their prime. I haven't heard anything about that since then, since that night. I wrote to the couple once who now live in the house and asked if anything strange had happened, any lights being shone through the windows, from local kids, as I put it in the letter, but they've never seen anything. Maybe it's because they're not alone. Maybe that's why I saw it. Of course, I couldn't let the thing go, not entirely. I needed some sort of explanation, so here it is. I spoke with a historian from a local college. I wanted to know about that spot of waste ground. What she told me left me stunned. A factory had been there at one time, 60 years before I moved to that house. The factory processed magnesium oxide. One day there was a terrible fire at the factory and the magnesium oxide began to burn. I was reminded of an experiment a chemistry teacher had showed me back in high school. When magnesium oxide burns, it produces a dangerously bright light. During the fire, 6 men were blinded by that light. The entire building then burned to the ground. There was only one casualty, a man named David Mackridge. He had been fired from his job there the day before. It was believed that he ignited the magnesium oxide himself. The fire was so intense it burned a large hole into the ground through the concrete foundations. It was assumed that David Mackridge's body was vaporized by the 3,000-degree heat. Now I know what that light was. And I know that that man, he's still down there somewhere, both haunted and haunting that piece of lonely waste ground.